What do the rise of Donald Trump, Black Lives Matter, and Brexit have in common? What they have in common is a deep frustration and an expression of a deep frustration by a lot of people who believe that their lives have been getting much worse for a long time. A lack of opportunity, wage stagnation, a very visible gap between how the rich live and how they live. Those frustrations are very real, especially in the US. Across an array of indicators, life has been getting very worse for a lot of Americans. Just take income. From the 40s to the 70s, virtually everybody, low, medium, upper income, their incomes doubled over that period of time. But since the 70s, life has been very different. The top 10th of 1% have seen their incomes go up 200%, whereas middle-wage workers like most of us have seen our incomes go up 6% over that time. Wealth is even worse. From the 40s to the 70s, wealth really was a great time of the democratization of wealth in America. And so in the 70s, the top 1/10 of 1% had a little more than 5% of all the wealth. Today, that 1/10 of 1% has almost 25% of the wealth. And it's even worse for people of color. Today, a black person earns 59 cents, a Hispanic earns 72 cents to every dollar that a white person earns. And wealth, the gap is almost incomprehensible. Whites have more than 10 times the amount of wealth that families of color have. Well, why do we really care about the gap between whites and people of color? Well, we are one big American family, so that's one reason. But if you don't buy into that, why we care about that is our economic future. The other thing that's changed in the 70s, since the 70s, is that our American economy has become more reliant on consumption by us, you and me. 75% of our economy is driven by what we spend. And this is a statistic that many of you have seen a lot of times. And that is by 2050, the majority population in this country will be non-white. It will be people of color. And so if those gaps between income and wealth stay where they are, or actually grow like they have since the 70s, we will have an economy that is way less strong than it is now, both locally and globally. That's not just a moral imperative that we close those gaps, it's an economic imperative. And the reason we need to worry about accelerating the pace of change is because we only have 30 years to close those gaps. The other thing that's frustrating to people, it's not just that those indicators have been changing and going the wrong way for so long. It's that we can't seem to actually apply solutions and solve the problems that will close the gaps. So here's one example. We all know and have long known that every year of education beyond high school gives you $200,000 to $300,000 a year $200,000 in lifetime earnings. So Fargo and many other places, you could buy a pretty nice house for that. Just a year or two more than high school. And in 2002, the Gates Foundation and others started to work with communities to say, let's build these early college high schools where you graduate high school with a high school diploma and with 1 or more years of college credit, oftentimes even an associate's degree. And so over those 14 years, about 300 high schools have done that, but 26,000 haven't. Another example is jobs, job creation. We have known for years that the majority of jobs created in our country are created by companies that are less than 5 years old. That for years, those companies have created 2 million or more jobs a year. But since the late 70s, the number of startups has been going down every year. And a couple of years ago, for the first time, the number of startups actually was bypassed by the number of companies that actually went out of business. 30 years, and we haven't been able to figure out how do we change that trajectory. Why? Why can't we solve those problems? Why can't we close those gaps? It's because our problem-solving mechanisms are broken. The problems we have to solve are too complex for the way that we attack the problem. We actually need to bring very different people together to get to a very different result than the way we usually do it. So take income. If we really want to increase people's income, we can't just say, good, we'll help them get better education. But even if we did, to fix education, it's educators, it's universities, it's public officials. So they have the right education, they then need the job. Well, all of those people don't help you create jobs. Those are entrepreneurs. Those are people that provide capital. Those are the accountants who help them do the work. And even if they have the job, they can't get to work without a transit system that works. They can't get childcare unless it's available and affordable. Think of the different public, private, government, non-government parties that have to come together. We don't know how to do that. And so how do we build a new model that will achieve large-scale change, that will be able to accelerate the pace of change and address complexity? Well, that's what we at Living Cities have been trying to figure out for the last 6 years all over this country. And this is what we found out. It's possible, but there are 4 critical things that we need to do to be able to get there. One is we have to change the teams on the ground who are solving the problem. If we need people from diverse backgrounds to distribute the leadership to make the change happen, then we have to help communities bring the right leaders to solve the right problem to the same table for as long as it takes to solve it. And that may be a certain government official. It may be a certain nonprofit or more officials. It may be business communities, one or more. It may be the community itself and a number of citizens. But the right teams are critical to making it happen. But the second thing is, and the key about those teams, we wish that there was a superhero who would come down and solve our problems. It's just not that way. In fact, no one leader can solve the problem, but not even one sector can solve the problem. Because we can't nonprofit our way out of the problem. We actually can't tax and spend our way out of the problem. And the markets aren't going to solve the problem either. We need to use all of those. And the people around the table have to bring those tools to the table. But the second thing we need to do, we have the right team. We also have to start keeping score. The other problem we have is that we do a lot of work, but nobody pays attention to whether or not the needle is actually moving. And so these cross-sector groups of leaders are coming together, and they're saying, we're going to use data to decide where we are now and where we need to go and how fast we're getting there. And if we're not getting there, we need to change course. But not at the end when we say, oh, we failed, but in real time while it's happening. That's the second thing we've learned. Change the team. Keep score. And the third one is change the flow of money. For some reason, we think if we bring the right people together and they decide they're going to keep score, but we keep funding the same stuff, we're going to get a different result. It doesn't work that way. And the way it actually changes is those people at the table have to actually change the way they spend their money in their own institution or with others. That's step 3. Step 4, we have to change the way City Hall works and the way what we expect City Hall to work. So for years, 20, 30 years, I heard the number of students in the room. You weren't here then, but we started disparaging government 30, 40 years ago. Or we ignored it, even though government is a critical player, often a disproportionate funder of these systems that we actually want to change. So we need to help them. Just like we need to help every other entity and institution get better, we need to help them get better. And Bloomberg Philanthropies, my organization, and others have been doing that. And that, together with a combination of new leaders at the local level who are bringing in talent, who are using data to see whether or not they're getting results, and who are playing constructively in these new partnerships, we're seeing that change happen. So those 4 things together are actually working around the country. It's possible to make the change, but let me give you 2 very specific examples. And one is in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. So a number of years ago, the leaders there said, let's build a rail line, and let's make sure that we don't just get a rail line out of it, but we get within a half a mile of the rail line all kinds of other things that are going to benefit low and middle income people. And they set out a dozen things that they wanted to see. Crazy ambitious things like 4,000 units of affordable housing. Or let's make sure that none of the small businesses along the line actually go out of business while we're building the line, which often happens. And so every month for more than 3 years, the right leaders came around the table. The people who ran the transit agency, the people who funded businesses, the people who built and developed affordable housing, mayors and county executives from 5 different jurisdictions, 5 different groups from philanthropy, civic leaders. And every month they got together and said, what have you done in the last month to drive these benefits beyond the rail? A couple of months ago, they did the ribbon cutting on the Green Line, and they announced that they'd met substantially all of those incredibly ambitious goals. One example. But another, quite differently, is in Cincinnati, Ohio. So about a decade ago, there were race riots that rocked the region. And the leaders in the community said, what is it? And they said, we're failing our kids from cradle to career. They're not ready for kindergarten. They can't read by 3rd grade. They're not graduating high school. They're going to college and not completing it. And then even if they complete it, they don't have the skills that Procter & Gamble and other companies need to hire them. The whole thing is broken. And we're all responsible. Whether we train people to be child care providers, or we fund them from the United Way, or we run the K-12 system, or we're the employers who don't force universities to train people what we want, we all need to be around the table. And they set out 6 metrics along that continuum. And years later, they've improved in double digits every one of those metrics. That model is now virally growing in 60+ places around the country. We can do this. We can actually address the frustrations that gave rise to Donald Trump, to Black Lives Matter, even to Brexit, if the Brits do it. But what we found is something really interesting, is that it's all largely contingent on one thing: individual behavior change. A couple of years ago, the Boston Fed tried to figure out why is it that some post-industrial cities have been able to turn themselves around and others haven't. And so they said, let's throw economists at this problem and look at 25 cities. And they did. And the economists ran the numbers and they said, I don't see any patterns about why some places worked and others didn't. And so they said, well, maybe we should go talk to the people. And they did, and they went and talked to leaders in all these 25 cities. And what they found was that those cities that were able to turn themselves around had one thing in common: multiple individuals in the same place who had a shared vision and led from wherever they were sitting. And so what that meant was the CEO said, I'm going to give my people a raise, or I'm going to direct my spending and my contracting to local companies. The university head and the superintendent said, let's build early college high schools. The government, investors, philanthropists said, let's make money available to companies to start up businesses and grow, or to homeowners so they can get first-time home loans and build wealth. And citizens started holding their officials accountable to play constructively in these kinds of partnerships. And what we've seen is we can realize the promise of America, the American dream for all, but it requires each of us to have the humility to understand how hard these problems are to solve, but the hubris to believe that our individual contribution can make a difference. A number of years ago, Margaret Mead said this. Many of you have heard this before. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Well, it's true. We actually can accelerate the pace of change. We can close those gaps between rich and poor, between white and people of color, but it requires each of us to get up and lead from wherever we sit. If you're not already doing that, get up today and go do it. America needs you. Thank you.